Honestly, really an honor for me to be here, to be talking about this topic and about a book that I've now published several years ago, but which made a little bit of a splash. It did well in America. It's actually a topic that before 2017, I even talked about in mainland China at a couple of talks to a certain degree of interest and acceptance. But it's a topic that I fear is getting increasingly sensitive over the past several years. And so even though this is a history really talking about the late 19th, early 20th century, it does seem to have a resonance with what's happening today. So thank all of you for coming out. My book, Land of Strangers, does pose a certain challenge to a lot of our assumptions about the world. It asks, can the efforts of elite Confucianism create a situation that is colonial in nature? And my answer, my tentative answer in this book is, it sure seems like it. That's not how I actually began the project, but that's where I ended up. To walk you through it, let us begin with a period that I think pretty much everyone in the room is familiar with, and that is the great transformation of the great Qing Empire in the middle of the 19th century. Now, if you're at all familiar with Chinese history, you've heard of the Taiping and the other wars that broke out in the middle of the 19th century that came out of massive change at the grassroots that led to interventions by new elites, new kinds of weapons, new kinds of social and military organization, and that in many ways transformed China at the grassroots. If you're American, you know that the Civil War was damaging, but really it was a reconstruction that followed that transformed our society into what it is today and created the racial tensions that now exist in their current form. Similarly, scholars are increasingly arguing that it was these 19th century conflicts, which, as you can see, took over about a third of all of Qing territory, and their subsequent reconstruction that remade Chinese society from the ground up. So let's root our discussion in that moment. Because even though I'm talking about Xinjiang, we're also talking in the context of an entire empire under transformation. We're going to see some of those actors happening here. We'll have to know about a group of people who are often thought of as the saviors of the Qing, the Xiang army or Hunan army, which was an army that emerged from the grassroots here in Changsha, the capital of Hunan province, and was led by local Confucian elites who believed in their own mission to save civilization and the world. And this army was one of those responsible for ending the civil wars breaking out across China at this time. And for this reason, their leaders are remembered in many ways as heroes of China. Part of my argument today is that their ideology, once they came to Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, led them to try and transform this region from a loosely held territory, governed largely through native or indigenous customs and norms, into a territory meant to be assimilated to the territory, norms, and customs of China proper. This period is also what many Uyghur scholars and others consider the beginning of East Turkestan's colonial period. The moment when this territory here, which had been conquered in the 1750s but ruled very indirectly for a century, was, after a series of uprisings, reconquered and then transformed intensively and purposely for the first time in its history into an inalienable part of the Chinese cultural sphere. So this is obviously a very important period. And like Uyghur scholars have often said that this period, the late Qing, the 1877 to 1911, was really the moment when the region became colonial. But we've always talked about it really in the very abstract terms. Yeah, sure, it's a region that was conquered, but that's about all that we've said about it. I have had different questions. So this is a period when modern Uyghur or Uyghur identity also really began to emerge. This is a period when the social structures began to change. Clearly, something was happening. And so I want to set out and find out what those changes might have been. And I did so by focusing down on this one town, Turpan or Tulofan, the region or oasis in eastern Xinjiang that the Xiang army had first entered and that subsequently became a major site of that army's efforts to not only control Xinjiang in a new way, but to assimilate the native people to Confucian and Han Chinese customs and norms and ways of life. Now, here's also part of the intervention. Previous scholarship has frequently used Chinese language sources to explore the history of this region in this period. But here's a problem. At most, only 5% of the population was Chinese. Most of those involved either in the administration or as merchants. And so privileging Chinese sources really says very little about the everyday. It can tell us what the rulers thought about and what they wanted, but we know nothing about what happened on the ground then. Other scholars, like myself, use sources in a language called Chagatai. Chagatai is like pre-modern Uyghur, the Wenyanwen of Uyghur language. And people have used these sources to talk about everyday life from the grassroots, but rarely do they get to use these to talk about politics. So my intervention in this book was at first relatively simple. I just want to know, how do people experience Chinese rule? Simple question, right? We know that Xinjiang, East Turkestan, was brought into the Qing Empire. How did people on the ground actually feel about that? No one had really asked that question before. And so I decided to use both sets of sources, think about the ways that they're in dialogue with each other through translation, and somewhere in that process, locate something about historical change. And what I found was a social history that looks a lot like colonialism. And that resulted in the books that you can see here today, and that we're talking about. Here's the English language one. Here's the translation in Chinese. The basic goal of the Xiang army, once it had retaken Xinjiang, was to transform Muslims into Confucians. Now, mark that language. I'm not saying Uyghurs into Chinese here. It wasn't actually the case that the rulers of this region wanted to turn people from one ethnic group into another. No, for them, it was that there was a difference in teaching. The chief proponent of this idea, that we'd take the region's Muslims, turn them into Confucians, and thereby make Xinjiang part of China culturally and politically, and thereby inseparably, was really this guy, Zuo Zongtang, known to Americans as General Zuo. Many of his writings, even from the 1830s onward, talked about the need to assimilate Muslims, because to him and to his group based at Changsha, the people who came to lead this army, they saw Muslims in their midst as the quintessential other. People who were clearly civilized because they could read books, but not the right books. People who had scholars who taught them ritual and taught them comportment, but the wrong scholars, teaching them the wrong rituals and the wrong comportments. These are people who had marriages, but in Islam, it's actually quite easy to secure a divorce, especially in the Hanafi school of law that predominated in this part of the world. And so to Confucians, who held the principle of one woman marries one man for life, no takebacks, this was deeply and fundamentally offensive. So these Confucian scholars like Zuo Zongtang even looked out at the world and they said, why is China in chaos? And their answer was, because people aren't doing their marriages properly. Honestly, if you go into the hinterland of Hunan, you can find polyandry, you can find all sorts of arrangements, right? What we're really looking at is an elite Confucian who wants to save the world by fixing everyone's families. And now he has an army to do it with. By the time that Xinjiang was reconquered by the Xiang army, this new civilizing mission was on full display. So here's just a quote from one of the prefects of Turban, one of its Han Chinese rulers, who was talking even years later about how marriage by Muslim customs is beyond proper human relationships. 出于论常以外. This was a pervasive ideology held by the government of Xinjiang in the late Qing period. Almost all of whom, actually over 67% of whom, by my own statistics, came from the area around Changsha and were associated with this same Confucian movement, which wanted to save the world. So this is interesting. Now, we have military power and political might behind a project to change the way that people relate to each other at the ground level. We have what we might call a civilizing mission, or in Chinese terms, transformation by teaching, 教化. Here's something else I want to make really clear here. For Confucian scholars, it was the general mission to teach others how to be proper, to teach people in the lower classes, to teach the emperors how to be proper. And people like Zuo Zongtang believed that when they were fighting the Taiping, all these other wars in the center of China, they were also completing a mission of 教化, but not only by retaking territory, but then by reinforcing traditional conservative legal and family codes. By the time they got to a culturally different area, such as Xinjiang, now they found people who seemed really, really improper. And the civilizing mission continued out there. It had gone from civilizing the underclasses to civilizing the other, people who are ethnically and linguistically different. So how are they going to do that? One was to turn young, what we call Uyghur Muslim boys into interpreters. Governor Liu Jintang, now Liu Jintang's a really funny figure. He was very young when his uncle was killed in battle on the way to Xinjiang. And then he was basically given his uncle's commission, and shortly thereafter, at the age of 33, made governor of Xinjiang. And Liu Jintang did not want this job. He sent many letters back to Beijing saying, please remove me from office. None of this is working out. This whole civilizing mission thing is going terribly. But, nevertheless, the efforts continued. One of the first things the government did when it entered Xinjiang was to set up schools. The idea being to assimilate the other kind to our Chinese ways, mainly by making them wear Chinese clothing, speak Chinese language, read the books, and elucidate the classics. And by the books and the classics, we mean, 四书五经, right? We mean the classics. And this is absolutely what they did. Everywhere, they started setting up hundreds, in fact, of Confucian schools, which taught a very traditional Confucian curriculum, from the Sanzi Jing all the way to the Shi Jing, and convinced Muslim parents, Uyghur parents, to send their children into these schools. What was the idea behind this? Well, from a very patriarchal Confucian perspective, the idea was that these young men, having been exposed to the brilliant light of Confucianism, would immediately see the error of their barbaric ways, change their hearts, change their minds, go on home, and then spread these values, norms, traditions, and love for Confucianism to the rest of their families. That is, the Xiang army was planting the seeds of a new society. And this was urgent, by the way, because they were supposed to make Xinjiang into a province by 1884. They'd given themselves a 7-year deadline to take an alien territory full of people who didn't like them, didn't speak their language, didn't practice their religion, and didn't share their culture. Within 7 years, they were supposed to be culturally assimilated enough that they could function in a province like anyone else in China proper. So this was an urgent and sort of front of mind problem for the new Xinjiang government. So how did this work out? Interestingly, now we all know that assimilatory projects don't work terribly well. I'm thinking in the case of British India, for example, there was this idea that by teaching Indian people science, you would make people who were in mind British, but Indian in outward appearance. This is the same kind of project. Now we know that in places like India or any other place engaged in a colonial project, it doesn't really work. You can't just assimilate people. Largely they resist, they appropriate, they misunderstand. By trying to assimilate, you actually set another different process in motion. In this case, we might assume that the schools, the Confucian schools, were like those that Australians, Canadians, Americans, and many others forced indigenous people into. The famous boarding schools that stripped indigenous people of their languages and their rights and their cultures, and were vectors of tremendous violence. This was a little different, actually. Funny enough, I've had difficulty finding instances of actual coercion, where families were actually obliged or forced to send their young children to these Confucian schools. I found instances where they could not be compelled, in fact. I found an instance where, when a teacher was found to have beaten his students, he was expelled from the entire province. Why? Because according to the government, if we do anything like this, we will not gain their hearts and minds. So in fact, in many ways, the government was very mindful in an orthodox Confucian sense that they needed to be as gentle as possible and get local elites on board with this educational project. And again, that didn't always work. For the most part, these interpreters stayed at these schools, didn't become Confucians, but they did learn the language in ways that would then help them get ahead in life and become indispensable to any act of translation between the Chinese and Uyghur languages. So they were pervasive, well-known, and often resented. One great example is a guy named Ai Xueshu. Great name. Sounds like loves to read books, right? It's a good nerdy name. So Ai is a phonetic derived from his own Uyghur or Muslim name, and Xueshu means study the books, study the classics of Confucianism. So Ai Xueshu, as it turns out, came from a very poor family. He wasn't a member of the local elite, and he was induced to join the school by the many rewards that it might bring him and his family. Learning how to speak Chinese well enough and get access to the administration was appealing for a lot of people. For him, he was such a good student, here he is in the rolls at the Lamqin school outside of Turpan, that they gave him a seized plot of land that they'd taken from someone who'd been convicted in a criminal case. And he held this plot of land for several decades. Later on, he built a cotton weaving factory on it. He was sued several times by his workers for failing to pay them. That was in the late 1920s, and then he died, leaving the bills unpaid. In the meantime, he had quite the career. Ai Xueshu, I actually found him later on in the archive with a bilingual Chagatai and Chinese document. His actual name is Imin Niaz by birth. So Imin became Ai, I. Imin Niaz. He worked as a clerk in the local administration for quite some time. He was well regarded by many of his Chinese peers, and eventually he became the first magistrate in Xinjiang, that is, appointed official, who was not Han. He was Uyghur. And obviously the Han people he tried to rule over hated him and ended up driving him out of the county. But we might consider this a kind of achievement, right? That actually this set of schools could provide a path to success for some people, at least for young men. But like I said, these people were actually widely despised. They were called Tongqi. This is from the Chinese word Tongshi, meaning interpreter. And in Uyghur, people just called them Tongqi, the one who tongs. It's actually a very derogatory, derisive kind of term. Because even though these young men were indispensable, they were also completely untrustworthy. I've been tracing the lives of these Tongqi across time. Some of them get sued up to 14 times, just in like the known historical record, because they're not trusted by anybody, even though they have to be part of every transaction. In this case, so here we have the Tarikh-i Hemedi, the great Uyghur chronicle of the 19th century by Mullah Musa Sairami. And Sairami, here he is telling the story of the earliest peopling of the earth after the flood. So after Noah, you have his three sons, Sam, Ham, and Japheth, who people the earth. And then we get many different kinds of people. Sairami, who lived through this whole period and wrote during the Civilizing Project, actually takes these interpreters and inserts them into the early history of the world as a disruptive force. He's not the only person to do this. Later people, there's even a legend from the early 1920s that says the Qing Empire fell because of Tongqis, and because God would not stand for the things that Tongqis were doing, that they weren't translators, but they were in fact responsible for causing societal disruption. So this is interesting. We have these male interlocutors who have accepted some of the Civilizing Project for their own purposes. They're finding their careers into the administration, making a lot of money on the side. And from the elite perspective, from the Confucian perspective, they should be the best intermediaries ever because they've learned the classics. But from a popular perspective, they're dangerous. So that's the male gendered part of this project. What about the female gendered part of this project? These are two very different experiences. As I've already flagged, the Xiang army was interested in family making. Now, they weren't just interested in making Muslims into Confucians, they were still concerned about their underclass. The Xiang army carried with it 60,000 men who had walked all the way from Hunan, and they'd done so because they didn't really have a lot of marriage ties or anything waiting for them back home. These were the rootless men whom Confucians derisively called bare sticks or guanggun. And they thought, well, okay, we've gone all this way. There's no more war left to fight. What do we do with these guys? All they know how to do is fight. And for Confucians, they really look down on the lower class, especially lower class men, who they saw as essentially dangerous, possibly even homosexual, as they talked about it. And so what were they going to do? Here's the solution. So remember I said about how in Islam it's relatively easy to get divorced, as opposed to under Confucian customs.
So Zong Tang and his followers looked at that and said, clearly Muslim women are licentious and lascivious and have no morality. Clearly they are just exotic women ready to be sexualized. Well, so the solution was, let's take these unmarried men and these unmarried Muslim women who can't seem to find a single partner and force them to get married. Now they'll civilize each other, because according to basic Confucian theory, the husband-wife relationship is a means to civilization and settling. And so that's what they did. I'll give you an example here from Ms. Wei. She's actually a Hui, Chinese-speaking Muslim, but I think her testimony is a great example of this. She had been fleeing out of Gansu, along with her husband, Mr. Ma, right ahead of the Xiang army, fleeing into Xinjiang, and they had tried to flee away towards Russia together, to the Ili Valley. They got separated. Ms. Wei got caught up by the refugees agency, the Nanminju, which was an agency which was gathering up dislocated people, of whom there were tens of thousands in the region at this point, and resettling them on farms. The refugees agency looked at her and said, well, you've got 2 children, you keep saying you're married, well, that doesn't matter, you're clearly a loose woman, we're going to find you a good Han Chinese, non-Muslim husband, a demobilized soldier. They took these 2 people, married them together, and settled them in the desert outside of Kuchad, on the northern rim of the Tarim Basin. It's a terrible place to farm, but at the time it was believed that through the power of matrimony and the power of farming, a good moral activity, so Zong Tang actually thought you could make the desert bloom and run with rivers and water. That Xinjiang, which is largely desert, was just waiting for the magical touch of Confucian civilization to transform its very ecology and make ideal agrarian life as known in Hunan possible. Her husband showed up 10 years later, and a lawsuit ensued. Mr. Ma came back and said, well, she's not Mr. Zhang's husband. This is an illegal marriage that's been arranged between my wife, Ms. Wei, and Mr. Zhang. And the dispute went back and forth a couple of times, but ultimately the provincial government ruled that her marriage to her Han Chinese demobilized soldier husband was proper and good, and had now been sanctified by the birth of 2 further children. Therefore, it was decided that she would stay on the farm, because it was a good Confucian marriage, not one of those different, not quite right Muslim marriages. There are many, many more, quite frankly, much sadder stories involved in this. The economy of the time was such that Uyghur women were some of the poorest people in the region, especially displaced Uyghur women. Uyghurs were the poorest, Hui, Chinese-speaking Muslims were in the middle, and Han Chinese soldiers didn't have much, but they had money and they had weapons. And so there emerged a brisk trade in women's bodies and women's lives. Human trafficking became pervasive. In fact, when I first opened the archives of Turban Prefecture, I saw within the mul, with a table of contents, pages upon pages of cases labeled wife kidnapping, human trafficking, etc., etc., etc. I said, this has to be the main story. But it's one that no one's ever talked about. We have an example here of a woman named Ruwaida Khan. This is a note from an official document. Yang Banchang of Handun married the Muslim woman Ruwaida Khan, who died for unknown reasons, leaving behind her daughter Peach Blossom. Her brother Savut has brought a lawsuit against Yang Bensheng. So what actually happened here? In order to survive, she says it's because grain prices were too high and she couldn't afford to feed her own child, married herself to another demobilized soldier, this one from Hubei, with the surname of Zhu. This was a very common strategy both across China and in East Turkestan at this time, because how else are you going to survive? You can find a husband who will help provide for you. When Mr. Zhu went back home to take care of his aging parents, he did not bring Ruweida Khan with him, this Uyghur woman, and he did not bring their daughter, Peach Blossom. Zhu entrusted this woman to two of his friends, that's how the story goes, two of his other old army buddies, who then, a couple years later, got a letter from Mr. Zhu saying, well, we can't sustain her anymore, so do what you will. And they sold her to a couple of brokers, a couple of Hui Muslims, who tied her and her daughter up, threw her on the back of a wagon, took them off to another village where she was slated to be properly married to another demobilized soldier, Yang Bencheng. I've come to know Yang Bencheng pretty well in my time in this archive. He lived alone with 9 other demobilized soldiers. So this is not a household in which one would willingly want to marry. And Ruweida Khan was far from willing. She complained mightily to her captors that she was already married, she already had a daughter, and she had not agreed to this. Shortly after arriving at the home of Yang Bencheng and his 9 army buddies, Ruweida Khan swallowed 2 balls of opium, and we can only hope that when she died it was peacefully and in slumber.
In the meantime, a man who was her brother, or claimed to be, was pursuing her, trying to figure out where she'd gone to, and eventually ended up filing a suit that led to an investigation into what turned out to be her death for unknown reasons. Interesting thing about her daughter, by the way, you notice the name is Peach Blossom. There's no surname here. There's no given name. In Han Uyghur marriages in this period, boys frequently took their father's surnames and became Chinese and went off back home with them. Young women almost universally were given cute names or objectifying names like Peach Blossom, Osmanthus Fragrance, 8 Cash 50, White and Black Sugar, names that kind of reference their mixed heritage. We also find these names very frequently in cases involving sex work in this period, which was where sort of half Han, half Uyghur women often ended up, marginalized in their own society. What happened with this case? Well, Peach Blossom was entrusted to a distant relative, so she ended up somewhere safe. We don't know what happened to her afterwards. And Ruweida Khan was declared to have been a martyr for Confucianism by the provincial government. The provincial government decided that there were no criminals involved here, only that Ruweida Khan had clearly killed herself because she wanted to remain faithful to her first husband, according to good Orthodox Confucian principles, and therefore she should be made an example for everyone else in this benighted barbaric land of the principle of following only one until the end, having only one husband. They erected a monument in her honor. No one was punished, but they managed to erase her story quite effectively. So we have a sense of the male-gendered possibilities here, that men could be led into the Chinese administration, becoming more and more Chinese perhaps, in order to pursue success in Xinjiang. And they'd sort of leave their own communities, but at least they were employed and doing well. Women, if they crossed that boundary, were punished, forgotten, degraded, crushed under the machine. And so you might think that the assimilatory project wasn't working too well, and indeed it wasn't. Like many assimilatory projects, it resulted instead in estrangement, the deepening of boundaries. And by the way, the book is called Land of Strangers for a couple reasons. One is because really it's a story of how an attempt to assimilate led to estrangement and deeper divides between communities, but also because it takes place in Turpan, Ghariban Turpan, as is known in Uyghur, or Turpan, the land of strangers. Thus known because it was a place of social fragmentation, not least of all because of things like this that I'm describing here. So, how did the Chinese react to this? Chinese settlers, who had all come from different places, Hunan, Shangzhou, Tianjin, etc., all over the map of China, normally they would associate with their own local place. You go to China, you know that co-local identity, Tongxiang identity is really, really important. But it's funny, in this borderland, as in every colonial borderland, people from different parts of the metropole began to identify with each other. They began to build common cemeteries and to advocate for themselves not as people of Shangzhou, people of Hunan, people of Tianjin, but as people who are Han, Chinese, people from China. This is one of my favorite cases because it illustrates this really well. It's a dispute over graveyards. A group of Chinese merchants who had previously identified separately identified as Han and approached the authorities saying, "Oh, the Chinese bones, those buried in the ground, how angry they are with the Muslims. The Chinese spirits, how frustrated with the Muslims. Those who dig the Chinese graves, they anger the Chinese people." So they're showing real identification as a group here, as a common group of settlers and farmers in the borderland. The English and the Scottish started to do the same thing in their own colonies. But what's funny is, again, I'm thinking of Albert Memmi here and his work on colonialism in North Africa and the layeredness of colonialism, these Han also saw themselves as being naturally allied to the colonial project, being allied to the government, and basically saying, well, why don't you protect us better? We should be your agents on the ground. They complained that, if our emperor wishes to guide these people to Huazhong, transform into Chinese, that is to transform into people of the center, he must make them walk within the law. We frequently see this language from Han Chinese in the archive in the late Qing period, speaking about themselves as representatives of the true way of China and as agents of assimilation and civilization. In fact, some of the merchant groups even began to work for the local administration to do things like investigate murders. So in some ways, yeah, the Han settlers were agents of the state. We also see this, and this is a little different. So at this point, Muslim clerics began to realize that the state was very interested in families and proper marriages. And Muslim clerics were also, one, feeling that they were losing control of Muslim women's bodies and became increasingly concerned about policing Muslim women's sexuality. And they realized that they could use the state against members of their own community who had strayed from the path. This is one of several examples we have of a group of Muslim clerics petitioning local authorities, Ulu Dalaoye is from Chinese Dalaoye, right? So they're talking to the local magistrate. There's a translation which is very different. I just want to make a note here. This is why Tongqi were important, but also treacherous. That's the original, that's the translation. They're like 40% the same. And that's because, you couldn't just address Chinese power using the words of Muslim society and culture. You had to pay someone to learn the tropes and the vocabulary that someone in power would respond to, right? So these Tongqi were actually really essential to what these men were doing, which was drawing boundaries around their own community. So these men approached the Yamen, approached the magistrate and said, some degenerate Chantou, Muslim women, come back to that word in a second, have moved into the city and intentionally act as prostitutes, harming the transformation of customs. We ask that you forbid this so as to bring peace to this place and eliminate bad customs. Originally, they'd had this whole story about how prostitution was making locusts come into the region and destroying the crops. They had this kind of magical argument, and that got edited out for the final version, which was about transformation of customs. So their argument was, we have women along the highway who are both, in some cases, have mixed heritage, but mostly are having sex with Chinese men, and we want to get rid of them. And they successfully petitioned the Yamen to enforce the transformation of customs. How did they get rid of these women? They were exiled and forced to marry men and reclaim land in the desert. So the same process that Ms. Wei went through of being forced into a marriage, sent to the desert, was now being used by Uyghurs against members of their own community who were having sex with Han Chinese men in order to expel them from that community. And this is quite common in the archive. You see, for example, an Uyghur woman, a Muslim woman, who had become the concubine of a Han Chinese soldier, an officer. And she was well known for walking around in Chinese dress her husband had given her. She was not allowed to be buried within the Muslim cemetery, but was buried in a special area outside of the old city of Turpan that appears to have been reserved for people who had crossed this boundary. So in life and in death, the communities were increasingly separate, and the boundaries were harder and harder. That sense of boundaries, centered around this word, Chantou. This is today a very derogatory word for an Uyghur person. It literally means wrapped head, as many of you in the audience know. At the time, it was the standard way that people in power in Xinjiang referred to Turkic-speaking Muslim people, referred to Uyghur people. And people noticed this. Increasingly in Turpan, by the early 1890s, we see people we now call Uyghurs using instead the term Chantou to refer to themselves, even among themselves. We have interviews even from people talking about what it means to be Chantou. There's a word Uyghur was not being used yet. People mainly refer to themselves in this period as Musulman, meaning simply Muslim or proper Muslim. But the emergence of this term from the administration to refer to an in-group with a specific set of practices identified by the state tracks with this hardening of boundaries around the communities. And it seems like before there was a label on Uyghurness, people were starting to call it Chantowness. You can see examples of that later on. This is a poem by Abdullah Postgami, rather bitter, disenfranchised intellectual from outside of Yarkand who wrote around the turn of the century. I enjoy Abdullah Postgami. He has a collection of poetry. Some of the poems are just like listing all the kinds of bread. Round bread, short bread, bread that's long. And it just goes on like that. And he's like, writes poems about officialdom, he writes poems about things he sees in the world. And he writes a poem about these people called Chantou. What is a Chantou? It's not a Musulman, it's not a proper Muslim, it's not Chinese, it's not a Hui, it's Chantou, it's something else. And here in Postgami's writing, we actually see reflections of this entire civilizing project. We see the way he talks about it, Everywhere, there are new schools. Aha, the Confucian schools are being set up. These youngins rush to be officials. Oh, people are going to these schools to get official positions. Some Chantos married without the faith. They're only Muslims on the surface. Okay, so marriage customs are being violated by these people who aren't properly Muslim. They're getting married somehow, he says, but not in the proper Muslim manner. They're not really Muslim, even though they look like us, they've been changed. With such women and their husbands, there is nothing illicit. Their belief in man and wife is just a show. So now he's complaining about violations of Muslim morality, whereas the Confucians have been complaining about violations of Confucian morality. Now we're starting to see the boundaries harden even more around what it means to be Muslim. They learn to be Muslim from being Chanto. Says the poem. And that rhymes in the original, it's really nice. So, he's seeing a social change come about as a result of this civilizing project that draws men in a certain way and makes them less Muslim, and draws women in a different way and makes them less Muslim. And she's seeing the boundaries harden as Uyghur elites themselves, Muslim elites themselves, use the state to police the boundaries around their communities. And it shows up, as so many social changes do, in literature first, before people are fully cognizant of it. This term Chanto is so important that, in fact, come the time of the first Uyghur National Revolution in 1933, we even see some people in the northeast, in Turpan and Kumul, organizing national movements on behalf of what they call Chanto Khalte, the Chanto people. So they're not even using the Uyghur term yet, but they're using this term which comes out of Qing administrative language to advocate for themselves violently against Chinese power. Why? Because to be that is to have experienced a certain kind of discrimination, a certain kind of rule in a way that they all know. That identity is shaped profoundly by the Qing administration and the failure of the assimilatory project to assimilate and its success in alienating. And so in 1933 in Sharq-i Turkistan Hayati, pretty much the first newspaper in East Turkestan, we have this essay by an anonymous essayist, probably Kutlukhaji Sharqi, about are we Turks or are we Chantos? Well, what are we? Are we Turks? Do we belong to the great Turkic people of Eurasia? Or are we this local provincial thing defined by Chinese rule? He says we've been given a name by the ignorant, bigoted Chinese people. But our country, our land is Turk, he says, rejecting that term. Ultimately, modern Uyghur identity, as it's articulated in the 1930s and as it was institutionalized, will find a kind of middle ground between these positions. Uyghurness is clearly Turkic, but is not universally Turkic. Uyghurness is shaped by Chinese history in some ways, but it runs deeper than that, is bigger than that and more capacious. I bring this to say that this idea, the senses of self that had come out of the Chinese experience really mattered to people very, very deeply. When you look more broadly at the Muslim literature, the Uyghur literature reflecting on this period, they're very, very clear in their stance. They point out, and this is Sairami again, Mullah Musa Sairami, who I think is a great example of this kind of thinking. They suggest that while from a Confucian perspective, it is the Muslim classics that are wrong, in a sense. Actually, he rewrites history to suggest that, in fact, Confucianism is a bastardization of Islam, which is to say that no, the colonizer has got it wrong. They're the ones with the wrong kinds of books. They're the ones with the wrong kinds of clerics. They're the ones who will ultimately be assimilated to our religion. And indeed, in this period, legends begin to circulate about the Emperor of China being converted to Islam. At first, sometimes secretly, there's a suggestion that the Emperor of China has actually accepted Islam ancestrally, and someday he will reveal his Islam. There are legends saying that upon a time he even did, and destroyed all the idol temples. One way or another, there's a kind of longing for recognition that we see here, which is also very common to colonial contexts globally, where people of the borderland, one, pose their own spiritual tradition as being stronger than the military and political might of the colonizer, but two, also begin to see their own history at the periphery as being wrapped up in the history of the metropole. That is, history of the farthest edge of the empire is actually tied in intimate ways to the history of the royal house. Like I said earlier, there was a legend circulating that the Qing fell because of what these tongqis, these interpreters, were doing. And God would not stand for it, so he smashed it, leading to the modern Republic of China. This is all to say that this period is full of phenomena that look a lot like colonialism. Now, when I began this entire investigation, I was actually very, very agnostic about the idea of colonialism as a framework, because I didn't want to determine my results before I did the study. In the field of Chinese history, the idea of colonialism is complex, it's poorly understood, it's really fraught. And if you want to talk about colonialism in the Chinese context, 殖民主义, that's another level of political difficulty. You really can't say that China has been colonial, because China has been colonized systematically, brutally, and in the long term. And it remains a point of pride in China, as most of you know in this room, to say that China does not colonize and cannot colonize. And so to suggest this, I thought, might not just be provocative, it might be even imposing a Western framework where it doesn't belong on a society with a radically different intellectual tradition and social tradition. Nevertheless, by the end, I was forced to admit that the best points of comparison for what happened in Xinjiang in East Turkestan in the late Qing period most closely resembled colonialisms, as you know, in the British India, in Southeast Asia under the Dutch and others, in French West Africa, in Canada, in America, in Hawaii, in Hokkaido in Japan. It seems like almost a paradigmatic case of colonialism because we see an attempt at gentle assimilation, gentle is in quotes, leading to new kinds of violence that might not be sharp at the end of a spear, but they might be gentler. And they might be more pervasive, like the new policing of boundaries around the Muslim community. We see sharper lines of identity form. That's really common in colonial situations, especially as the colonizer frequently gets more concerned with separating groups of people out from one another. Now, so this Confucian civilizing mission, much like European civilizing missions, began in some ways in the metropole and was in dialogue with the periphery. It was both about assimilating the lower class and about assimilating the peripheral other, using similar techniques and similar ideas, and a similar discourse of pedagogy, of teaching the poor, stupid children how to behave. And yet it was distinctly Chinese. So I mentioned earlier that, we think of residential schooling as a deeply violent and systemic act of cultural genocide. And that's typically what it is. The example that we have in Xinjiang today was arguably cultural genocide. It is widespread, systematic, relies on residential schools. Same in Tibet. But in this case, we actually see an attempt to be as gentle as possible and to draw people in only through positive incentives. Now, what about the other gendered side of this? We talked about the male gendered, but what about the female gendered side of this? Okay, in colonial situations, we frequently see that the larger political project plays out in the sphere of the intimate in complex ways. But it's very, very rare for a colonial power, globally speaking, to make men and women from different cultures settle down together in this way. It happens certainly, but it's not usually the focus of that kind of project. Whereas here, we see a project that is actively dedicated to ameliorating the boundaries between peoples by forcing them to marry one another. Now, I'm thinking of Anne Stoller's work, you should read some Anne Stoller if you haven't before, on Southeast Asia, where she also talks about the policing of intimate boundaries. And the colonial moment there was about drawing sharper lines, not about forcing more assimilation. So there are parts of this which clearly resemble European colonialisms. But there are parts of it that also clearly come out of a distinct sub-tradition of Confucianism that was deeply focused on the family and changing people at the grassroots. One way or another, I tend to think that the proof of these things is in the pudding. That is, we can detect colonialism's long-term effects in culture by seeing how people respond to these sorts of programs. And what I see in Uyghur literature and in cultural responses to this program is something that also looks a heck of a lot like anti-colonial, let's say colonial responses to empire in places like Peru and West Africa and South Africa and Southeast Asia. And so consequently, in my book, I was forced to conclude that this sure looks like colonialism. And I hope that you're convinced too. And if not, I'm very happy to talk about it. Thank you once again to Jifeng Shuyu and to JF Books. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you're successful.
In your archival research, have you found cases of women really trying to reclaim their autonomy and subjectivity, even taking radical measures like suicide?
Reclaiming one's subjectivity and agency, it's a hard thing to see in a Qing archive because by nature, the Qing Imperial Chinese Archive is edited to pieces. It's always a product of translation, rethinking, the redeployment of tropes. So where do you find the authentic voice? It's hard to discern. We do find it in some cases, and unfortunately a high number of suicides. People who run away from their situations are not uncommon. And there are a number of situations where a woman has been forced into a family because of some instance of war or forced marriage, and then she gets to assert later on to the magistrate and say, no, I'm from this community, not that one. But the problem is, just as all of these people realized that the state was really concerned about family, the only way to make an appeal for one's autonomy was within that paradigm of the family. So if you wanted to say, I don't belong here, you had to say, actually, I belong to a different family. You find this actually in 1864, the outbreak of the violence in this region. Many Han Chinese children were either adopted or enslaved, it depends who you talk to, by Muslim families. Some of them grew up very happily in these families. There's one young Han boy who was adopted when his parents were killed. He was named Islam. Great name for an adopted kid. He was apparently loved, grew up Uyghur style for years. But eventually when his adoptive father died, his brothers tried to force him out of the family. And so he had to make claims for himself on the basis of being, ritually speaking, his father's son. You have other situations where, especially Han women, were married out to Han men in what they believed to be permanent marriages, but their adoptive parents thought were temporary marriages. That's a whole other topic we have to talk about. They would refuse to be returned to their adoptive families by saying, no, I'm Han, not Muslim. So that's the kind of voice that we can see. It's very blurry. The only other place to look for this stuff is in indirect records in Chagatai, where what I'll say is I see a lot of women participating in the marketplace and in handicrafts as their own economic actors. I think that's one of the places we have to look for women's history in this region.
With the fact that Qing is actually like a Manchu-led dynasty,
Yeah.
why do you think this notion of Confucianism and Han-dominated way of ruling is still so prominent, given that they are an ethnic minority themselves?
Yeah, this is always a problem in studying Qing history. Because on the one hand, the Qing was multi-ethnic. It spoke in multiple languages. The Qing spoke Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, Chinese, Uyghur, etc. And yet, so this community that Zuozongtang and these people come out of in Changsha was not very covertly, pretty strongly anti-Manchu. A lot of the writings they were reviving were those of Wang Fuzhi and Huang Zongxi, and Wang Fuzhi especially had been an anti-Manchu guerrilla fighter. So they were rewriting and reprinting his texts as guides to saving Chinese civilization. So they had this whole theory. They asked, why was China getting smaller? Why had China been conquered? And they said, once upon a time, Chinese civilization had been the north, at Chang'an in the ancient capitals. That's when we did our ritual best. That's when we were good Confucians. But then we lost our Confucianism in the north, and the center of that moved south to places like Changsha. We here in the south, they said, are the true guardians of Chinese culture. And that's why the north was lost to barbarians. And then they started writing, this is in the 1840s, I think, if this gets any worse, we're gonna end up in Vietnam. We're gonna keep going south and we'll lose all of the original homeland of China. And so following Wang Fuzhi, they believed that in order to save Chinese civilization, even within the multi-ethnic Qing, they had to teach people to do their rituals properly and to be good Confucians. And they could sort of use the Qing Empire's institutions to expand their own power and their own imposition of what they saw as proper morality. They had multiple tools to do this that were handed to them in the midst of the Taiping War, including exceptional punishments, special powers to execute people who were acting immorally. They really did seize the opportunity. And the last point I'll say on this is, I mean, a lot of what they were attempting in Xinjiang, the Qing court was originally very opposed to. And yet Zuozongtang had this tendency to disobey orders and just do what he wanted to in terms of segregating Muslims from Han and Gansu and then forcing people to assimilate in Xinjiang. And then by 1907, the Qing court was also trying to get all these Hunanese people out of the Xinjiang administration. So there was always a tension there. They knew that something wrong was happening, but by this point, the Qing court was too weak to do anything about that.
Do you see any parallel between the Confucius Institute that they're building right now and the thing that you describe in your book?
The current projects taking place in East Turkestan and beyond have a resemblance to, but are very different from, what I describe in this period. Today we have what's really an ethno-national state disguised as a multi-ethnic state, trying to propagandize Han Chinese culture abroad in order to gain soft power, and then to assimilate people forcibly to a certain set of norms internally, using the power of a digitally empowered, strong state with tremendous amounts of resources at its disposal. And yet, back in the early 2000s, as Xibo Da Kai Fa began, as the Open Up the West program began, and all the way until 2017, you could see in Chinese academic writing this idea of reviving the late Qing project. And people started to speak about Zuozongtang as a model for what they should do next in the region. I found that really interesting because the restrictions on Uyghur language and education began in 2001. They really ramped up in 2004 and 2005 with the removal of Uyghur from the educational system. Now again, that's very different, right? And they've continued to this day. You might know the term Min Kao Han. Min Kao Han means a person from a non-Han group who did their exams in Chinese. And people started to write in newspapers and in academia, well actually, the students from Zuozongtang's time, they were the first Min Kao Han, and we should get more of them. So there is an adoption or an adaptation of the past or an appropriation of it for this modern project in a lot of ways. But it's very disingenuous, I think, or it's very ignorant.
Could you share some of the earlier anti-Muslim tropes that emerged? Are they still the same or have they evolved?
I have a friend, David Stroup, S-T-R-O-U-P, who's doing very good work on contemporary, especially online discourse around halal and how halalness is being erased from the public sphere in China and what people think of Muslims in this way. And some of those tropes are basically that Muslims are very violent. That's basically what it comes down to. That Muslims are violent, that halal food is somehow unclean. The idea of violence is partly associated with the fact that a lot of Muslims, especially Hui Muslims, served in the military in the Qing And so actually, there is an association between soldiering and being Muslim historically. But of course, violence by Muslims was, relatively speaking, quite rare across China. So look for David Stroop's work. That'll have some good citations for you.
In the beginning of the talk, you talk about it's not a shift from. At what point do we see the conflation of Confucian and Han, or where do we see practices mixing with ethnic identity categories over the course of this period? Or is this a distinction that elite people are making of Muslim to Confucian, and on an everyday lifestyle, maybe these identity categories and these practices were already conflated in everyday use? I'm just curious kind of where that line is and how it shifts.
Okay, so to some degree, the idea of being Han, the idea of being Confucian were already conflated. But from an elite perspective, being Confucian was civilizational. It was capacious. You could become Confucian. But for people on the ground, they didn't see that metaphysical dimension of Confucianism. They assumed that if you were Han, you'd be Confucian. And like so many other colonizers and settlers around the world, they might want to make other people act like them and act properly, but would never truly accept them as being assimilated. So there is that distinction between the elite theory and the on-the-ground practice and sort of folk theory of what it means to be Han Chinese and or Confucian. That said, so the distinction between being, say, Musulman, Uyghur, properly Muslim in that language, and Hui was still relatively loose, despite the fact that during the Muslim uprisings, that line had been drawn pretty firmly by violence. The Muslim uprising of 1864 had begun as an effort by many different kinds of Muslim, but by the midpoint, it had turned into a war between Turkic-speaking Muslims and Chinese-speaking Muslims. And Yaqub Beg, the officer from Hokkien who conquered the region, made it very clear that he was out to destroy as many Chinese-speaking Muslims as possible. So that line was drawn by violence, quite clearly. That said, in this period, you still see people slip between these identities pretty frequently. We have a guy named Lin Shengtian, who, as far as we know, is Han Chinese, but sometimes he's Hui, sometimes he's Uyghur, sometimes his name is Naim Beg, and he's also a British Indian citizen. So, people did move between these categories still. But it was in this period, I think, when it became explicitly a problem. This is a period when, early on in the archive, we see people use different ethnic signifiers or status signifiers in the archive. You can be a Chan, but you can also be a Min, might be identified as a Hui, maybe even a Han. And the same person will inhabit these different identities. From several years in, the official record, people are clearly identifying as one category or another. So there seems to be a change happening in here somewhere on the ground. It's difficult to discern the moment when this might have changed, when the real hinge was, but it's definitely somewhere in, I'd say, the 1890s.
How currently the Chinese official discourse on this part of history, is it like rebranded as Xinjiang has always been part of China, or there's some more restrictions inside China research on this part of history?
In 2014, I gave an hour-long talk, very similar to this, at Xinjiang Shifan Daxue, to a group of 200 people, and it got a great audience, great discussion afterwards. I gave a similar talk at Hunan Daxue, Yelu Shuyuan. The challenge, I never use word colonialism, but in the Q&A after the talk, this guy raised his hand and said, what you're describing sounds like colonialism. Why don't you just say colonialism? So it's interesting, like several years ago, before the big crackdown under Xi Jinping, there seemed like there was a lot more room in Chinese academia to talk about this stuff. In fact, as of 2017, I had made plans with a group of my colleagues from Xinjiang and Gansu to move forward on a general project in history and anthropology to re-examine this region from the ground up. And we were very, very excited. 6 months later, half the people in that group were imprisoned. And I've been trying to carry on their work ever since. It's one of my main motivations for being here. So there was a lot more room for this, and it changed very suddenly, very swiftly. The person who used to run the Xinjiang Islam Jiao Yanjiu Zhongxin, the Research Center for Islam in Xinjiang, a wonderful Japanese-trained historian of Sufism in the 18th century, was forced to change his institute into the Institute for the Study of Islamic Extremism and to publish only on political topics relating to the security of the state. So the apparatus of the study of East Turkestan in China has been turned entirely towards the study of security from a deeply Islamophobic perspective. In terms of historical discourse, it's funny, if you read older PRC writings on this period, they talk about the Uyghur people's righteous uprising against their Qing oppressors, and how this is a righteous peasants' revolt, and Zuozongtang was a tool of the imperialists. That all changed a couple of decades ago, obviously, and now Zuozongtang's a national hero. And all of these uprisings are splittist, 分裂主义者, or they're Islamic extremist. And so, yes, it's as you were suspecting, the entire historical discourse has been turned towards asserting that East Turkestan has always been a part of China. There's no room for anything else. Which is funny because I'm told that the Tibet issue is supposed to be resolved now. They're allowing a lot more historical investigation into the Tibetan past. I think that East Turkestan remains very sensitive.
I was wondering if your work has got any attention in China, and has it been a source of trouble?
It seems to be well regarded, funny enough. At least the reactions I've gotten or seen online are pretty positive. I think in part because the way that I approach this, and this is due in part to the feedback of Toby Meyerfong, a teacher at Johns Hopkins, who gave me some good advice. I really root the book in social history, in something concrete and in the facts as much as possible. I don't begin with a big framework and say, I'm going to tell you why China's colonial. I tell you that this particular group of people did this specific thing, and it was really interesting for these reasons, had these social ramifications, and boy, does that look a lot like colonialism. And I think that that's a better way to temper this. About a year ago, I got a visit from the Chinese embassy, and they had read the book. They'd read it in English. They hadn't yet had the Chinese copy yet, which had just come out. And they said they liked it, which surprised me. They said they liked it except for the part where I compare things to colonialism, which was interesting. I don't know how they're reading it exactly, because really the book is very critical of all sorts of things, including conservatism generally. It's critical of Islamophobia. It's critical of the way that people dominate other people. It's critical of empires in the 19th century. There's a subtle critique of the Republican Party in this book, by the way. It begins with a discussion of my friends who've been imprisoned, and it ends with a talk about being unable to outrun the big machines that are crushing the world. So regardless, they came by to tell me that they think I'm a very objective scholar with whom they can productively disagree. So that's a reaction I've gotten so far. People in Taiwan seem to like it.
That's thanks again to the professors who
Thank you, JF Books.